The sheriff's cruiser lights washed my front porch in red and blue when the doorbell rang. For a moment I thought someone had died. When I opened the door, 2 men in suits were standing there, and one of them said a sentence that made my stomach drop. "Ma'am, we're here because of something you did last week at a gas station outside Tulsa." I stared at him confused. "$1, he said. You gave a veteran $1. I had no idea that Dollar was about to tear open a fraud ring that had been quietly robbing old soldiers across 3 counties. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where the story really begins. I retired from the Marine Corps 2 months before all this happened. 22 years in uniform, most of it overseas. Afghanistan twice, Iraq once, a handful of places nobody ever puts on the news. When I finally hung up my dress blues, I moved back to Oklahoma. Tulsa was close enough to family, but far enough away that nobody asked too many questions. Retirement felt strange. In the Corps, every day had a mission. Civilian life mostly had grocery lists. That morning was nothing special, just a gray Oklahoma sky and the kind of cold wind that slips under your jacket no matter how tight you zip it. I had driven about 20 minutes outside Tulsa to fill up my truck. Gas was cheaper out there, and the station had decent coffee. The place looked like 100 others scattered across rural America. A squat brick building, 2 fuel pumps that had seen better decades, a faded Budweiser sign flickering in the window. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and motor oil hung in the air. I remember noticing the man right away. Older, late 70s, maybe early 80s. He wore a faded army cap that had the words "Vietnam Veteran" stitched across the front. The bill was bent from years of use. His jacket was thin for the weather. He stood at the counter with both hands on the glass, carefully counting coins. Pennies, nickels, dimes. He moved them slowly across the counter like each one carried more weight than metal should. The cashier, a young guy with a bored expression, watched him with growing impatience. "Sir," the kid said, tapping the register, "it's $1.49. The old man nodded and pushed the coins closer. "I'm just about there." His voice had that quiet rasp you hear in men who've lived a long time. He counted again. 27 cents short. He checked his pockets. Nothing. I could see the moment it hit him. That small slump in his shoulders. He started pulling the coins back toward himself. "Sorry," he muttered. "I'll come back another day." I don't know why that bothered me. Maybe it was the hat. Maybe it was the way the kid behind the counter was already rolling his eyes. Or maybe after 22 years in the Marines, something in me just couldn't stand watching an old soldier walk away from a cup of coffee. I stepped up beside him. "Put it on my tab," I said. The cashier looked confused. "You don't have a tab." I slid a $1 bill across the counter. "That should cover it." The old man turned toward me slowly. Up close I could see the lines in his face, deep ones, the kind carved by sun worry and time. "You don't have to do that," he said. "It's just $1, I replied. He studied me for a moment. Then his eyes drifted to the small Marine Corps sticker on the back of my truck keys sitting on the counter. His expression softened. "You served?" "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "Army," he said quietly, tapping his hat. "Long time ago." The cashier handed him the coffee. He wrapped his hands around the paper cup like it was a small heater. "Thank you," he said. Not loud. Just sincere. I nodded back. "No problem." I grabbed my gas receipt and headed outside. Cold air slapped my face as the door shut behind me. I filled up the truck, climbed in, and drove back toward Tulsa. By the time I got home, I had already forgotten about the whole thing. Life does that. Small moments slip away before you even realize they mattered. The next week passed quietly. I unpacked boxes, fixed a loose fence board, called my sister. Normal things. The kind of life Marines don't get very often. 7 days later, just after sunset, I was sitting in my living room reading when headlights flashed through my window. A vehicle pulled into my driveway. That was unusual. I live on a quiet road outside town. Visitors usually call first. Then the doorbell rang. One sharp chime. I set the book down. Old habits die hard. Even after retirement, I still check windows before opening a door. 2 men stood on my porch. Both wore dark suits. One held a leather folder. The other looked like the kind of man who notices everything in a room before he steps inside. Behind them, parked along the curb, sat a black SUV. Government plates. I opened the door halfway. Can I help you? The taller man gave a polite nod. Ma'am, are you Sarah Cole? Yes. He exchanged a quick glance with his partner. Then he said something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We're looking for the Marine who helped a Vietnam veteran at a gas station last week. I frowned. I help a lot of people. The man's name is Walter Briggs. The name didn't mean anything to me, but the image came back instantly. The army cap. The coins. The coffee. What about him, I asked. The second man spoke this time. Mr. Briggs asked us to find you. I crossed my arms. Why? The taller man opened the folder slowly. Inside were photographs, documents, and one image that made my stomach tighten. It was a picture of the gas station where I'd stopped. But this photo wasn't taken during the day. It was taken at night, with police tape across the doors. The man looked back up at me. Because Ms. Cole, he said quietly, that dollar you gave him may have exposed something very serious. And for the first time since leaving the Marines, I felt the familiar pull of a mission beginning. I did not invite them in right away. At my age, or maybe I should say, after the life I'd lived, you learn not to open your door wider than necessary for two strangers in dark suits carrying folders. The taller one looked to be in his early 50s, clean-shaven, neat haircut, polished shoes. The other man was broader through the shoulders with silver at his temples, and the kind of stillness I'd seen in former law enforcement and old infantrymen, men who didn't waste motion. The wind moved dry leaves across my porch. I kept one hand on the edge of the door. You said Walter Briggs asked you to find me. I said, who are you? The taller man reached into his coat slowly, careful not to make the kind of movement that raises alarms. He handed over a wallet ID. My name is David Mercer. This is Tom Ellison. We work with the Oklahoma Veterans Legal Assistance Foundation. I looked at the card, then at him. It looked real enough. Not flashy, not federal, just the plain kind of identification nonprofits and legal offices carry. Tom gave me a small nod. We're not here to sell you anything, ma'am. Don't call me ma'am unless you mean it, I said. That brought the faintest smile to his face. Understood. I stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind me. It wasn't that I was afraid of them. It was that I was cautious by training, and caution had kept me alive in places where people smiled before they lied. What happened at that gas station, I asked. David glanced at the black SUV parked behind them, then back at me. May we talk somewhere private? I studied them a moment longer, then motioned toward the two wooden chairs on the porch. You can talk here. They sat. I remained standing. David opened the folder again, this time showing me a photograph of the old veteran I had seen at the counter. He looked cleaner in the picture, a little younger somehow, though that may have just been the light. Same face, same cap. That's Walter Briggs, David said. Army, served in Vietnam, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. I looked down at the photo longer than I meant to. He didn't seem like the kind of man who'd send lawyers to a stranger's house. He isn't, Tom said. That's part of the reason we're here. David took over. Mr. Briggs came to our office 3 days ago. He said he wanted to locate a former Marine who helped him pay for coffee at a gas station outside Tulsa. That was all he knew about you. Former Marine. Woman. Pickup truck. He noticed you're bearing your haircut and a Marine Corps sticker on your keys. That sounded like Walter. Older men who'd served could spot military in a grocery line from 20 feet away. I folded my arms. So you tracked me down over $1. Tom shook his head. Not exactly. The dollar got our attention. What he told us after that is what brought us here. David slid another paper from the folder. It was a copy of a property notice. Past due taxes, legal language, county filing stamps. Walter Briggs is in serious financial trouble, he said. I frowned. He looked broke. He is broke, David said plainly, or very close to it. There was no drama in his tone, just facts. He explained that Walter lived alone in a small house northeast of Tulsa. His wife had died 6 years earlier. No children, limited Social Security, modest VA benefits. He'd gotten by carefully until the last year when a series of assistance agreements and refinancing offers had left him trapped in debt he didn't fully understand. Who signed him into that mess, I asked. That's what we're trying to untangle, David said. And Walter believes the gas station may be connected. I stared at him. Connected how? Tom leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. That station has become a regular stop for a handful of older veterans in that area. Some live alone, some have memory issues, some are just proud and won't ask for help. Walter says a man there started talking to him months ago. Friendly at first, offered coffee, mentioned programs for seniors and veterans, property tax relief, home repair help, legal assistance. I felt something tighten in my chest. In the Marines, you learn to identify a setup before the ambush begins. And let me guess, I said. The paperwork wasn't what it claimed to be. David gave a slow nod. That's our concern. He told me Walter had signed documents he believed were related to emergency home repairs and tax relief. Instead, those papers may have transferred partial rights to his property, tied him to predatory loan terms, and opened the door to foreclosure. Walter hadn't understood any of it until notices started arriving. He didn't come to us because of the paperwork, David said. He came because of you. I let that sit for a second. Why? Because David said he told us that after months of being handled, rushed, and talked over, you were the first person who treated him like he still mattered. That landed harder than I expected. The porch suddenly felt colder. I thought of Walter standing under fluorescent lights trying to buy 1 cup of coffee with pocket change while some cashier waited for him to fail. I thought of how small the moment had seemed to me. It was $1, I said quietly. Tom looked up at me. To you. None of us spoke for several seconds. A dog barked somewhere down the road. A pickup truck passed in the distance, tires humming on the highway. Finally, I asked, why didn't he just go to the police? David exhaled. He did. Sort of. He made a report, but there wasn't much to go on. The paperwork had signatures. The people involved used legal-looking companies. Everything was arranged just carefully enough to look voluntary. Tom added, and men like Walter often feel ashamed. They think getting fooled means they failed some basic test of common sense. I had seen that kind of shame before, strong people blaming themselves for being targeted at a weak moment. David closed the folder halfway. We're building a case, or trying to. But Walter asked for one thing before anything else. He wanted to thank you. In person. I let out a breath through my nose. That's all. That's where it starts, David said. He'd like to see you tomorrow if you're willing. I should have said no. I had only been retired a couple of months. I was still figuring out who I was when nobody was issuing orders, and nobody expected me to solve the room I walked into. I had promised myself I would stay out of other people's trouble for a while. Plant a garden, fix up the house, learn how to live quietly. But something about the way they talked about Walter bothered me. Not pity. Respect. And something about the papers in that folder bothered me even more. Predators don't just steal money. They strip people of dignity first, makes the rest easier. Tomorrow when I asked, David's face relaxed a little. 10 in the morning, we can drive you or you can follow us. I'll drive myself. Tom nodded like he expected that answer. David handed me a business card with an address written on the back. His place is in Claremore, small white house off an old county road. We'll be there. I took the card. Before I agree to anything else, I said, answer one question honestly. David waited. Was the gas station raided because of Walter? The 2 men exchanged a glance. Then Tom answered, no, not because of Walter alone. He paused. Because Walter may not be the only veteran they've done this to. That was the first moment I understood this wasn't about one old man being cheated. This was a pattern. A method. Maybe even a business model. David stood, and Tom rose with him. They thanked me for my time and walked down the steps without another wasted word. The black SUV backed carefully from my drive and disappeared into the night. I stayed on the porch long after the taillights were gone. The air smelled like dry grass and wood smoke. I looked down at the card in my hand, then at the darkness around my yard. The Marines teach you that trouble usually announces itself in pieces. A detail here, a bad feeling there, a loose thread on what looks like a finished coat. The wise move is to pay attention before the whole thing unravels. The next morning I drove northeast under a pale sky and followed 2-lane roads through stretches of winter pasture and old fence lines. Walter's address took me past a feed store, a church with a hand-painted sign, and a row of modest houses built back when people expected one home to last a lifetime. His place was a small white house with peeling trim and a sagging porch. The yard was neat, though. That told me more than the condition of the siding. Men who have given up don't usually keep a neat yard. Walter was already outside when I pulled in. He stood with one hand on a cane and the other tucked into his jacket pocket. Same army cap, same weathered face. When he saw me get out of the truck, he straightened a little. For a second, his eyes went bright. Then he gave me a nod like we were meeting on equal terms. "Marine," he said. I walked toward him and nodded back. "Army." He smiled at that. "Small, real." "I was hoping you'd come," he said. I looked past him at the house, at the cracked steps, at the patched roof over the porch. Then I looked back at him. "Tell me what they did to you, Walter," I said. And the way his smile faded told me I was not going to like the answer. Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned toward the porch. "Coffee?" he asked. The way he said it made me think about that gas station again. The coins, the hesitation, the pride of a man who had spent a lifetime standing on his own feet. "Sure," I said. We climbed the steps slowly. His cane tapped each board with a soft wooden knock. The porch sagged a little under our weight, but held steady. Inside the house smelled like old wood and fresh coffee. Not fancy coffee, just the simple kind brewed in a glass pot that had probably been used for 20 years. The living room was tidy but worn. A small couch, 2 armchairs, a bookshelf filled with paperbacks, and a few military history titles. On one wall hung a framed photograph of a young soldier in jungle fatigues. Walter noticed me looking. "That was taken in '69, he said. Quang Tri Province." The young man in the picture looked lean, tough, and determined. A different world away from the man standing beside me now. "You were infantry," I said. He chuckled softly. "You can tell. The way you stand." That made him smile again. He poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to me. His hands trembled slightly, but the movement was practiced. We sat at the small kitchen table. For a few seconds, we just drank. The quiet felt comfortable the way it sometimes does between people who have worn the same uniform even if decades apart. Finally, I said, "Those men told me someone's been taking advantage of you." Walter stared down into his coffee. "Not just me," he said. He took a slow breath before continuing. "About a year ago, a man started coming around the gas station where you saw me. Friendly sort, mid-40s, nice truck, always buying coffee for folks." He paused. Said his name was Calvin Turner. I leaned back in the chair. What did he want? At first, nothing Walter said. Just talked, asked about the army, asked about the war, asked about my house. My jaw tightened slightly. "Predators start with conversation," I said. Walter nodded. He said he worked with a company that helped seniors and veterans with home repairs and tax paperwork. Claimed the county had programs we didn't know about. And you believed him? He didn't look embarrassed. He looked tired. "I checked the papers," he said quietly. Or at least I thought I did. He reached for a small stack of documents sitting on the table. Contracts. Loan agreements. Legal language packed so tightly it might as well have been another language. "I signed 3 things," Walter said. "One for roof repairs, one for property taxes, one for something called a temporary lien." I flipped through the pages. Every document had neat signatures, stamps, notary seals. But the terms were brutal. High interest. Transfer clauses. Accelerated payment triggers. "Jesus," I muttered. Walter gave a small shrug. By the time the notices started showing up, I realized what I'd done. Foreclosure. 3 months away, he said calmly. The calmness bothered me more than anger would have. "How much?" "About 80,000. I stared at him. For a man living on a modest pension and Social Security, that number might as well have been a mountain. "You couldn't pay that in 10 lifetimes, I said. Walter nodded. "That's the idea." The room went quiet again. Outside, a pickup drove past on the gravel road. "You're not the only one," I said. He looked at me. "There are others." Walter sighed. I figured. He stood slowly and walked to the living room window. "There's a man down the road, Navy, lost his wife 2 years ago. Same company helped him with his septic tank." He turned back. "He's losing his place next month." Another name. Another victim. "How many?" I asked. Walter thought for a moment. 5, I know personally, he said. That was enough to form a pattern. But something else bothered me. Why did the gas station matter, I asked. Walter's eyes darkened slightly. Because that's where Turner meets most of them. I sat forward. Explain. Walter leaned against the wall. Older veterans tend to keep routines. Same breakfast spot, same coffee, same seat at the counter. The picture formed quickly in my mind. A quiet rural gas station. Old soldiers gathering for cheap coffee and conversation. Easy targets. Turner shows up, Walter continued. Talks friendly, offers help. Then he introduces paperwork. I rubbed my temples, and nobody questions him. He looks respectable, Walter said, and he listens to our stories. That last part hit harder than the rest. Loneliness is a powerful doorway for people with bad intentions. How long has this been going on, I asked. Walter thought. Maybe 2 years. 2 years. That meant dozens of possible victims. Maybe more. My Marine instincts started lining things up automatically. Target group. Recruitment location. Legal cover. Financial extraction. It wasn't sloppy. It was organized. You said you went to the police, I said. I did. And Walter gave a weak smile. They said the contracts looked legal. Of course they did. Predators rarely break laws directly. They bend them until they snap. I leaned back and studied the room. The framed photo. The worn couch. The old man standing in front of me trying to stay dignified while his life was quietly being stripped away. You didn't ask those men to investigate because of the money, I said. Walter shook his head. Number. Then why? He looked at me with the same calm eyes he had at the gas station. Because when you put that $1 down, you didn't treat me like I was finished. The words hung in the room. He continued. Most folks don't look at old men very long. We remind them of things they don't want to think about. I didn't say anything. He sat back down at the table. I figured if a Marine was willing to stand up for a stranger over a cup of coffee, he said maybe she'd stand up when something worse was happening. I let out a slow breath. Retirement suddenly felt a lot farther away than it had yesterday. What do you want me to do? I asked. Walter looked surprised. Nothing, he said quickly. I didn't bring you here for that. But you hoped I said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The Marines teach you something simple. When you see someone being pushed down and you have the ability to stop it doing nothing, becomes its own kind of decision. I stood up from the table. Walter watched me carefully. What are you thinking? He asked. I looked at the stack of contracts again. Then at the photo of young soldiers on his wall. Then back at him. I'm thinking, I said slowly, that Calvin Turner made a very big mistake. Walter frowned. What mistake? I slid the papers back into a neat stack. He picked on the wrong group of people. Walter gave a tired chuckle. Old veterans. No, I said. I picked up my truck keys. Veterans who still have friends. He studied me for a moment. Marine, he said carefully, this kind of thing can get complicated. I nodded. Complicated doesn't scare me. He tapped his cane lightly on the floor. What scares you? I opened the door and looked back at him. People who think nobody's paying attention. The cold Oklahoma air rolled into the room. And somewhere in the back of my mind, something old and familiar woke up. The kind of feeling you get right before a mission begins. By the time I got back to my truck, I already knew I wasn't going to let it go. That was the truth of it. I stood beside the driver's door for a moment, looking across Walter's yard at a line of bare winter trees and a sagging fence that probably needed replacing 10 years ago. The place wasn't much by real estate standards, but it was his. A man's last years ought to be lived in the home he earned, not in some rented room because a smooth-talking parasite figured out how to wrap theft in legal paper. I got in the truck and shut the door. For a long minute I didn't turn the key. Instead, I sat there with both hands on the wheel and felt the old machinery in my mind begin to turn. Not anger, exactly. Anger burns hot and fast. This was colder than that, more useful. The same part of me that used to look at a village map, a convoy route, a half-truth in a briefing and start asking where the weak points were. Predators rely on isolation. That was the first thing I knew for certain. They separate people from information, from confidence from one another. They make every victim feel alone and foolish. Once shame does its work, the rest becomes easier. I started the truck and drove straight home, but I didn't stay there long. I made a pot of coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and spread out a legal pad like I used to before inspections. At the top of the page, I wrote 3 names. Walter Briggs, Calvin Turner gas station outside Tulsa. Then I added a 4th line. Who benefits? That question matters in any situation involving fraud, war, or politics. Usually in all 3, the same answer appears: the person who seems least rushed and most respectable. I called David Mercer first. He answered on the 2nd ring. Mercer. It's Sarah Cole. His tone changed immediately. Ms. Cole. Sarah. All right, Sarah. I need copies of every document Walter showed you, and I need the names of the other veterans who've come to your office with similar complaints. He was quiet a moment. That's not a small request. No, I said, it isn't. Are you taking this on? I'm looking at it. That was enough for him to understand. The names may be confidential, he said carefully. I can ask for permission. Ask fast. He exhaled. There are at least 6 that look related, maybe more. Similar language in the contracts, same notary in several cases, same contractor listed on home repair claims. Who's the contractor? Prairie State Property Services. I wrote it down. Real company. As far as the paperwork shows, yes. Whether it does the work it claims to do is another question. Find out. He gave a low, tired laugh. You really are a Marine. I really am retired, I said, which means I have time. That can be dangerous. It usually is. He promised to send what he could by evening. Then I made the 2nd call. My friend Ellen Ruiz had been a Marine judge advocate for 18 years before leaving service and opening a small practice in Oklahoma City. If there was a legal seam in this mess, Ellen would find it. She picked up with her usual no-nonsense voice. If this is a political donation request, I'm hanging up. It's Sarah. A pause. Then warmth. Sarah Cole. Well, I'll be damned. How's civilian life? Too quiet. That sounds like a complaint? It was until this morning. I told her enough to get her attention: old veterans, suspicious contracts, fake assistance, foreclosure, pressure, gas station, recruitment point. By the time I finished, Ellen had stopped making little amused noises and was fully in lawyer mode. Send me scans, she said, especially the signature pages, disclosure language, line clauses, and any transfer provisions. You think it's fraud? I think it's either fraud or abuse dressed up as informed consent. Either way, old men on fixed income don't accidentally sign themselves into $80,000 obligations because someone offered roof work. That's what I thought. She was quiet for a second, then said, Sarah, what? Be careful. I'm sitting at my own kitchen table. That's not what I mean. I knew what she meant. People who prey on the elderly don't always look dangerous, but the money behind them can be. I'll be careful, I said. She made a sound that told me she did not fully believe me. By late afternoon, David had emailed scans. I printed them out and sat with a red pen circling repeated names, addresses, notary stamps, company titles, and timing patterns. 3 things jumped out. First, the same 2 entities kept appearing: Prairie State Property Services and Turner Asset Recovery Group. Second, the supposed repair estimates were inflated beyond reason. A porch patch listed at $12,000. Roof work billed at $28,000. A drainage job with no contractor photos, no permit filings, and no itemized labor. Third, the agreements triggered default fast. Miss one payment late by a narrow window and the entire balance accelerated. That kind of structure was not meant to help a homeowner. It was meant to push one off a cliff. At 6 o'clock, Ellen called back. I've seen uglier, she said, but not by much. Talk to me. These contracts are designed to survive first glance. The wording is technically sophisticated. Arbitration clauses, waivers, disclosures buried where an older person might initial without understanding. But there are openings, such as capacity issues. If the victims were misled, rushed, or cognitively vulnerable, fraudulent inducement if the sales pitch didn't match the documents, unlicensed lending questions, possible elder exploitation, possibly mail fraud if notices were sent across county lines. I wrote quickly. And the company's Prairie State is registered, she said. Turner Asset Recovery Group exists on paper too. Small office listing in Broken Arrow, minimal footprint, That alone doesn't prove anything. No, but it rhymes. Exactly. I leaned back in my chair. How many people do I need before this becomes more than a sad story? For prosecutors, as many as possible. For me, 3 clean patterns start to become a system. I may already have that. Then get statements, dates, names. Don't coach anyone, just document. That last part mattered. In the core, gathering information under pressure is one thing. In civilian life, especially if lawyers may touch it later, you don't contaminate the record by telling people what to say. You ask, you listen, you write it down. The next 2 days I drove. I met an old Navy machinist named Frank Dillard, who had signed repair papers after Calvin Turner told him county inspectors would condemn his septic line if he didn't act immediately. Frank's wife had died the year before, and he admitted he had not read half the pages put in front of him. He had trusted the man because Turner called him chief and knew enough about military service to sound convincing. I met a widow named Mabel Keene, whose late husband had been Air Force. Turner had persuaded her to sign a property tax bridge agreement she thought would postpone county penalties. Instead, it attached fees and terms she couldn't afford. Mabel cried halfway through talking to me, not because of the money, but because her son had told her she should have known better. That kind of thing stays with you. People are wounded once by the fraud, and then again by the judgment of those who didn't have to live through it. By Friday, I had 7 names. Not rumors. Names, dates, copies, similar scripts, similar pressure, similar outcomes. Every road seemed to lead back to the same gas station. Same coffee counter, same cluster of older veterans, same friendly middleman with a smile and a form. I drove out there just after dawn on Saturday and parked across the road near an old farm supply lot. I brought a thermos and watched through the windshield. By 6:30, pickups began rolling in. By 7, a regular crowd had formed inside. I saw Walter's description come to life in real time, old men in service caps, chore jackets, hands wrapped around coffee cups, trading stories because there are only so many places left where anybody lets them linger without buying a full breakfast. At 7:20, a silver pickup pulled in. A man in his mid-40s stepped out wearing pressed jeans, clean boots, and a quilted vest over a plaid shirt. Nice truck, expensive watch, friendly face. He entered the station carrying himself like he belonged there. 10 minutes later, through the front window, I saw him laugh, clap one man on the shoulder, and buy coffee for 2 others. Calvin Turner? He didn't look like a criminal. That was the point. He looked like a man who donated to youth baseball and shook hands at church. I watched him move from one old veteran to another with practiced ease, never too eager, never too formal. Just enough warmth to suggest trust, just enough confidence to suggest competence. When he came back outside, he stood by his truck talking to the station owner. They spoke for less than a minute. Then they both looked casually toward the parking lot where the older men sat inside by the window. Not a long look. Just long enough. That was when I knew the station owner wasn't just nearby. He was in it. Maybe not in the paperwork, maybe not on the contracts, but in the funnel, in the selection, in the setting. A hunting blind is part of the hunt, whether it fires the rifle or not. I waited until Turner drove away, then crossed the road and went inside. The coffee smelled the same as the day I met Walter. Burnt, cheap, familiar. The young cashier from before was not there. Behind the register stood a heavier man in his 50s with a red face and a name patch that read Dale. Probably the owner. He gave me a quick once-over. Need gas. Coffee. I poured a cup and paid cash. Then I nodded toward the old men by the window. Busy morning. He shrugged. Regulars. That fellow in the silver pickup seems friendly. No reaction at first. Then a little too casual. That's so. He bought coffee for half the room. Dale handed me my change. Some people are neighborly. I smiled slightly. Some are. Then I walked out. No confrontation, no threats, no need. Not yet. Because by then the picture was clear enough to matter. They weren't just scamming one lonely veteran. They had built a pipeline. And if I was going to stop it, I needed more than outrage. I needed proof they wouldn't see coming. The Marines teach you something about patience. People assume military work is all speed and aggression, charging hills, breaking doors, making noise. But the truth is that the most effective operations usually begin quietly. Observation first, movement second, action last. That's the mindset I carried into the next phase. By Monday morning, I had a list of 8 veterans who had dealt with Calvin Turner or one of his companies. 8 separate contracts, 8 similar stories, 8 homes sitting under the shadow of foreclosure notices. 8 is not a coincidence. 8 is a system. I sat at my kitchen table again with Ellen on speakerphone while we reviewed the papers one more time. "You're right about one thing," she said. "This is organized." "That's what worries me." "It should," she replied. "Predatory lending rings that target seniors usually run on volume. The more victims, the harder it becomes for any one case to stand out." "But they also get sloppy," I said. Eventually, she agreed. We went through the contracts line by line again. Ellen pointed out something I had missed. "Look at the arbitration clause." I flipped to the section. "Standard legal boilerplate," I said. "Not quite. The clause forces disputes into a private arbitration company located in Texas. So that company handles a lot of cases for firms accused of predatory lending. It's not illegal, but it's a pattern." That word again? Pattern. In the core, patterns mean predictability. Predictability means opportunity. "So how do we break it?" I asked. Ellen paused. "Turner needs to believe he's about to land a very profitable client." That got my attention. "You're talking about bait." "I'm talking about documentation," she corrected calmly. "Which looks suspiciously like bait. Only if you say it that way." I leaned back in my chair. "You think he'll take the hook? If he's as confident as you say, yes. Predators grow bold when their tricks keep working. Confidence is often their weakest point." By that afternoon, David Mercer had arranged a quiet meeting at his office with 3 of the veterans who had already filed complaints. Walter came too. He sat beside me at the table while the others spoke. Frank Dillard, the Navy machinist, told his story again, this time with dates, names, and copies of the paperwork he had signed. The anger in his voice was clearer now that he knew he wasn't alone. Mabel Keene brought a grocery sack filled with letters she had received from Turner's company. Late notices, legal warnings, threats of property seizure. She wiped her eyes while she talked. "I thought I was the only one stupid enough to sign those papers," she said quietly. Walter shook his head. "No, ma'am," he said. "You were just the one they reached first." David wrote everything down. Carefully, methodically. When the meeting ended, he closed his notebook and looked around the table. "We have enough here to begin a formal investigation," he said. "But that will take time." "How much time?" Frank asked. David hesitated. "Months." The room went silent. Months was a long time for people who were already weeks away from losing their homes. That was when I spoke. "What if we give Turner another opportunity to talk?" David frowned. "You mean confront him?" "No," I said. "Invite him." Everyone looked at me. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're planning something," he said. "Something simple." I turned to David. "You told me Turner is always looking for new clients." "Yes." "Then let's introduce him to one." David leaned back slowly. "You." "Exactly." Ellen's voice came through the phone speaker. "That could work." Walter looked uneasy. "Marine," he said quietly. "Men like Turner don't like being cornered." "I'm not cornering him," I replied. "I'm letting him walk into the room." That difference mattered. The plan took shape over the next 2 days. David arranged for word to reach Turner that a recently retired Marine had inherited land outside Tulsa and was interested in property restructuring. That phrase appeared often in Turner's paperwork. Predators recognize their own language. Sure enough, by Wednesday morning, David received a call from a polite voice asking if this Marine might be interested in discussing financial solutions. Hook set. Meeting scheduled for Friday afternoon. Location: David's office conference room. Walter insisted on being there. "I started this mess," he said. "You didn't start it," I told him. "But I'll finish watching it," he replied. Friday arrived cold and gray. I wore simple civilian clothes. Jeans, boots, a jacket. Nothing flashy. Nothing that suggested trouble. Ellen drove up from Oklahoma City to observe. David sat at the head of the table. Walter and 2 other veterans waited quietly along the wall. At exactly 2 o'clock, the door opened. Calvin Turner walked in. He looked exactly like he had at the gas station. Friendly smile. Firm handshake. Professional confidence. "Ms. Cole," he said warmly, I hear you may be interested in some financial guidance. I returned the handshake. Possibly. He sat down and opened a leather folder. Inside were the same kinds of contracts I had already seen. Predatory language dressed in respectable formatting. Turner spoke smoothly for the next 15 minutes. Tax relief. Equity conversion. Asset protection. All the right phrases. All the wrong intentions. Then he slid a document across the table. Of course, he said we'd just need a few signatures to begin the process. I didn't touch the paper. Instead, I asked a simple question. How many veterans have you helped this way? Turner smiled politely. Hundreds. Walter shifted slightly behind him. Turner didn't notice. And how many lost their homes, I asked. The smile flickered. I'm not sure what you mean. David leaned forward. I believe she means Walter Briggs. Turner froze. Slowly he turned around. Walter stood there quietly with his cane. Frank and Mabel stood beside him. Turner's confident expression drained away. The room felt very small suddenly. You set me up, Turner said softly. I shook my head. No, I replied. You walked in. David opened a new folder. Inside were copies of every contract we had gathered. Every victim. Every pattern. Every signature. And just outside the conference room door waiting patiently were 2 investigators from the State Attorney General's office. Turner looked at the stack of papers. Then at the veterans behind him. For the first time since I had seen him, he looked uncertain. And uncertainty is where confidence finally begins to break. Calvin Turner didn't run. That surprised me. A lot of men in his position try something dramatic when the walls close in. They argue, they shout. Sometimes they bolt for the door like panic might somehow erase what's already been said. Turner didn't do any of that. He simply leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Well, he said after a moment, this is awkward. No one laughed. The 2 investigators from the Oklahoma Attorney General's office stepped into the room. One of them, a tall woman with a gray blazer and calm eyes, introduced herself as Investigator Karen Holt. The other man stood quietly beside her holding a legal pad. Holt set a recorder on the table. Mr. Turner, she said evenly, we'd like to ask you a few questions regarding your business dealings with several residents of Rogers and Tulsa counties. Turner glanced at the recorder, then at the stack of documents in front of David Mercer. His smile came back, though it wasn't quite as confident as before. I assume this is some sort of misunderstanding, he said. David folded his hands. That depends on how you define misunderstanding. Walter was still standing behind him with his cane. The old man hadn't spoken yet, but his presence in the room seemed heavier than anything else there. Turner noticed him again. Mr. Briggs, he said smoothly, I'm sorry you're upset. My company has always tried to help seniors manage complicated financial situations. Walter's voice was steady when he answered. You helped yourself, he said. Nothing more. Just that. And somehow it carried more weight than a speech. Investigator Holt slid one of the contracts across the table. Mr. Turner, can you explain why repair estimates issued by Prairie State Property Services consistently exceed market value by 3 to 5 times? Turner shrugged lightly. Quality work costs money. Holt flipped to another page. Then perhaps you can explain why county permits were never filed for several of those repairs. Turner's expression tightened. I'm not responsible for contractor paperwork. Holt didn't raise her voice. Your company recommended those contractors. The room grew quiet. Ellen Ruiz leaned toward me and whispered, he's stalling. I nodded. Predators rarely admit wrongdoing the first time they're cornered. They test the room, look for exits, look for weakness. But the evidence was already laid out. 8 veterans. 8 contracts. 8 homes placed at risk. And that was only the beginning. After about 20 minutes, Turner finally asked for a lawyer. The investigators expected that. They gathered their materials and told him he would be contacted soon for a formal statement. When the door closed behind them, the tension in the room shifted. The storm hadn't passed, but the first crack of thunder had been heard. Walter sat down slowly. Frank Dillard let out a long breath and rubbed his face. I never thought I'd see that man sweat, he muttered. David Mercer closed the final folder. This will move forward now, he said. But cases like this take time. Walter nodded. I understand. Then he looked at me. Marine, he said quietly. Yes, sir. Walk with me. We stepped outside into the cold afternoon air. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of distant rain. Walter stood beside the curb for a moment, leaning lightly on his cane. You did more than I expected, he said. I didn't do it alone. He smiled faintly. No one ever does. We watched cars pass along the street. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Walter surprised me. You know something, he said. What's that? I never wanted revenge. I turned to him. That whole meeting in there, he continued, nodding toward the building, that wasn't about revenge. Then what was it about? He thought for a moment. Respect, he said finally. I didn't interrupt. When you get old, he went on, people stop seeing you, not out of cruelty, just life moves faster than you do. He tapped his cane gently on the pavement. After Vietnam, I built a small life. My wife, our house, a garden. When she died, things got quieter. And when men like Turner started talking to me, I wanted to believe someone still thought I mattered. His words settled heavily between us. That's how they got close, he said. Loneliness. I had seen that before. War zones, retirement communities, hospital waiting rooms. Loneliness is one of the most powerful forces in the world. Your dollar wasn't about coffee, Walter said. It was about dignity. I looked down at the pavement. I didn't think of it that way. He chuckled softly. That's why it mattered. We stood there a while longer. Then he said something that stuck with me. Justice is important, but revenge leaves a bitter taste. What about closure, I asked. Walter smiled at the horizon. Closure comes from knowing someone stood beside you. Inside the office, David and Ellen were still talking with the investigators. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken. Rain clouds rolling across Oklahoma farmland. Walter shifted his weight and looked at me again. You gave me something that morning at the gas station, he said. What's that? Courage to ask for help. I nodded slowly. And today, he added, you helped a lot more people than just me. For a man who had once led Marines into combat zones, it felt strange hearing that. But sometimes the quiet battles matter more than the loud ones. A week later, the investigation became public. Local news stations ran short stories about a financial scheme targeting elderly veterans. More names came forward. More contracts surfaced. The case grew larger than any of us expected. But Walter's house remained standing. And for him, that was enough. The gas station looked different 3 months later. Not because the building had changed. The same old brick walls were there, the same faded beer signs in the windows, the same 2 pumps standing out front like tired sentries. But the feeling of the place had shifted. You can sense those things when you've lived long enough. I parked my truck along the gravel edge of the lot just after sunrise. Oklahoma mornings have a particular kind of quiet in early fall, cool air, pale sky, and the smell of fields waking up. When I stepped inside, the coffee smelled exactly the same as it had the day I first met Walter. Burnt. Cheap. Comforting. But one thing was different. The man behind the counter wasn't Dale anymore. A younger woman stood there now, pouring fresh coffee into the pot. New ownership. After the investigation began, the state discovered the station owner had been quietly receiving referral payments for connecting Calvin Turner with the veterans who came in every morning. He hadn't signed the contracts himself, but he had helped create the funnel. That was enough. He sold the station before the charges reached him. Some people run when the truth starts catching up. I poured myself a cup and turned toward the window. The same row of tables sat along the glass. But now there were more men there. Veterans, Army caps, Navy jackets, an Air Force ball cap that looked older than the man wearing it. And at the center of the table sat Walter Briggs. He spotted me immediately. Marine, he called across the room. His voice carried that same rough strength it always had. I walked over and pulled out a chair. Army, I replied. The table chuckled. Frank Dillard was there too, the Navy machinist whose septic contract had almost cost him his house. Beside him sat Mabel Keene, who now helped organize weekly breakfasts for local veterans. There were new faces as well. Men who had heard about the investigation and decided to start showing up. Community builds itself slowly like that. Walter lifted his coffee cup toward me. Looks like you started something, he said. I shook my head. No, it was already here. Frank leaned forward. You know, they arrested Turner last week. I nodded. The charges were serious. Fraud. Elder exploitation. Conspiracy. Cases like that take time, but the evidence was strong. More victims had stepped forward. The pipeline had collapsed. Walter took a slow sip of coffee. You know what the funny thing is, he said. What's that? I still think about that morning when you put $1 on the counter. I smiled slightly. It wasn't exactly heroic. No, he agreed. That's why it mattered. He looked around the table at the other veterans. Big moments get all the attention in life, he continued. Battles, elections, court cases. He tapped the table lightly. But most of what shapes a person's life happens in small moments. No one spoke. The room was quiet except for the hum of the coffee machine behind the counter. Walter looked back at me. That $1 reminded me that people still look out for each other. He nodded toward Frank. And that reminder helped me ask for help. Frank grinned, which helped the rest of us. I leaned back in my chair and watched the group for a while. These were men and women who had served their country decades ago. Some had carried rifles in jungles. Some had worked flight lines, engine rooms, radar stations. Now they were older, slower, but still proud, still deserving of dignity. The waitress came by and topped off our coffee. Walter raised his cup again. You ever think about how easy it would have been for you to walk past me that day? Sure, I said. I almost did. He laughed. But you didn't. Outside, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds. Light spilled across the parking lot and through the front windows. The kind of simple light that reminds you the world keeps turning. Walter stood slowly and rested both hands on his cane. Well, he said, I suppose we should keep this place honest. The others nodded. Weekly breakfasts had become a routine. Veterans checking in on one another. Sharing news. Making sure nobody was slipping quietly into trouble. It wasn't fancy. But it worked. As I stepped outside a few minutes later, Walter walked with me to the truck. He looked stronger than he had 3 months earlier. Still old. Still moving carefully. But steadier somehow. You heading home, he asked. Yeah. He nodded. Good. He looked across the quiet highway. You know something, Marine? What's that? Justice matters. I waited. But kindness, he said, is what keeps the world from falling apart while justice catches up. I thought about that as I climbed into my truck. The engine started with a familiar rumble. Walter gave me one last nod. Take care of yourself. You too. As I drove away, I looked once in the mirror. Walter was already walking back toward the gas station. Toward the other veterans. Toward the small community that had grown out of a simple act. And I realized something. Sometimes revenge stories aren't really about revenge. Sometimes they're about restoring balance. About reminding people that dignity still matters. And about proving that even the smallest act of kindness can ripple further than we ever expect. So if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone who once helped you when life was hard, take a moment today and pass that kindness forward. Call an old friend. Check in on a neighbor. Or just buy a cup of coffee for someone who looks like they might need it. You never know how far a single dollar might travel. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if stories like this remind you that ordinary people still shape the world in quiet ways, feel free to share it with someone who might appreciate it too. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that help us look out for each other.